So, a warm welcome to part 5 of the Minds of the Future. My name is Anna Sjöström and I am the host of this roundtable discussion between brilliant young minds in science and Professor Sir David MacMillan, Nobel Laureate in Chemistry 2021. And this is taking place at the Nobel Prize Museum in Stockholm during the Nobel Week of 2022. And this question is has been produced together with the Luleå University of Technology. A large part of the Earth's arable land disappears in connection with climate change. At the same time, better conditions arise for cultivation in other places around the Earth. So how can we influence this change so that it leads to more sustainable and environmental improvements as well as better cultivation techniques? So maybe Xiaoqing, I'll start with you.
So I think definitely we see one of the impacts of climate change that already is happening now is how it makes the weather very unpredictable. So in terms of like droughts, like Australia bushfires, right, or like heat waves in Europe. So we already see that happening, and I feel like one way to ensure like our food security through all of this, because all these changes definitely affect our crops and stuff. So one way to ensure food security would be to find technological solutions so that we can cultivate crops without relying on kind of the weather or like soil. So for example, technologies like hydroponics, so where we use water and probably chemistry to grow the plants without the need for without it being vulnerable to like outside changes or like vertical farms and so on. So especially in Singapore, because we have very little arable land because we're so tiny, but we do aim to have 30% of our nutritional needs met by locally grown food. So we do turn to a lot of these technological solutions, having hydroponics, aeroponics, or using vertical, I think rooftop farms or this kind of stuff, so that we don't need to rely so much on arable land outside, but rather we can bring farming and cultivation indoors too, that we can better control it and we're not so vulnerable to the changes that are brought about by climate change.
That sounds like a really smart idea to have this, not because that's what we see all the time now, where we have all the things going on in the world with the climate and weather. So Hassan, I'm thinking, do you want to explore a little bit on this?
Yeah. So great point, Xiaoqing. So I'm going to expand a bit, give a pre-context on where we stand at this moment as one nation, if we consider all of us on this planet. So you mentioned about, unpredictable weather because of climate change. I think one thing we need to focus on is how our land use policies are really, really bad, because this is something which is driving climate change as well. So if we look at, rising temperatures, we are looking, and if we look at the Northern Hemisphere, for example, we are in Sweden right now, which is the boreal region. If people know about the different environments, ecosystems around the world, boreal is one of them, which is basically between 50 and 60 latitudes. So areas like Sweden or UK or the northern parts of Canada are getting more and more, suitable to agriculture, for example. And there's this, big conversation going on that, okay, are we going to shift, our agricultural, techniques or policies where we're gonna, produce more and more crops for a commercial, farming in these areas. But then lots of it depends on the hope that this is gonna work, but we do not know if it's actually gonna work. And these terrestrial ecosystems are also our carbon sinks. And if we are gonna change these ecosystem like the boreal, which consists of many evergreen coniferous trees and all that, carbon sinks, we might be going from a climate crisis into an environmental crisis, and we do not want that. We want something which is more sustainable. We want to make sure that if we are to continue to farm sustainably, we have to figure out how our current farming techniques are, which are not sustainable. This is not working. We need to kind of look into how we can, not drive the same techniques in the future and work for better farming techniques.
So better farming techniques and not reliable on weather. So, Noelia, do you have something other things that you are thinking about?
I would also like to bring up the topic of hydroponics. Right now, we are facing a crisis that, of course, will affect the use that we currently have of the soil. And this use would decrease the use of land by 90 to 99%, which is quite remarkable. But also, I think that agriculture, besides contributing to this climate crisis, is also affected by it. So we should also acknowledge this. And for instance, we might want to look at the use we do of fertilizers. They are currently used, but they also release greenhouse gas to the atmosphere. So perhaps we would like to change this so that we have a more sustainable use, but we also can profit from it. And for instance, there's been discussions about whether we should decrease the temperature these fertilizers require for their making, because really high temperatures are needed. So a lot of research is right now done on how we can decrease this temperature. But of course, coming back to the topic that has already been brought up in this discussion, we need funding for STEM solutions, because we are discussing a lot of ideas here, hydroponics, which requires a lot of economic efforts to be implemented. Also, we are talking about improving the use of fertilizers, but of course, we can only materialize these ideas if we have funding behind.
That's true. David, for fertilizers, fresh water, food production, do you see anything in your field within chemistry or organocatalysis? Is that something that can be used?
Yeah, so the fertilizer one is one which is pretty remarkable. Actually, the statistics behind that are based upon one catalytic reaction, and it's called nitrogen fixation, which takes nitrogen and makes any ammonia. And as it turns out, you couldn't have 8 billion people on Earth right now without this one catalytic reaction. Really remarkable. However, and to your point, which is exactly right, that one catalytic reaction uses up 1% of the world's energy supply every single day. That's an enormous amount of energy. It actually creates more than 1% of the world's CO2 production on a daily basis. So it's inordinately important for humans to have this one catalytic reaction, but it's also creating issues associated with it, obviously. But as the word suggests, and this you'll sound like I'm being a chemist and being biased, but catalysis is the way to solve this, because the catalytic process that we have right now requires this amount of heat. It requires this amount of energy. What we need is better catalysis. So there are reasonably large numbers of people working on this problem, but this is the same question we keep coming back to. You need more people, more resources, more people involved with thinking about that problem. How do you change the catalysis so that you can still achieve the production of these molecules that we need, but without actually creating so much energy burden, without creating so much carbon dioxide?
There are many things that needs to be worked on. As in all questions we have discussed today, there are so many layers and so many challenges, and many has to come together to work on this. Do you think, Hassan, is it something that we did not mention, or are there some areas or techniques or other things that we should also think about, and also for our viewers, if there is something that they should think about going into the future?
So just before coming here, I was having this conversation with a friend of mine in Cambridge about how can we make farming more sustainable. And one of the things, because she works on this, that's her PhD is based on this. And through this conversation, we were basically trying to figure out how can we manage land more sustainably, right? So she was mentioning about the use of containers, which is happening, that you can kind of use a container where you do farm and you can produce as much yield as 1 acre of farming land. So it's about, using land sustainably. And like David, Professor David has mentioned, that the use of fertilizers, right? It's something which is carbon intensive, and it does add to carbon emissions, right? So this is something which we need to kind of, again, have a conversation about when we are going to move into, when we have these conversations about food security, for example, or when we are going to consider that, okay, if there are permafrost regions which are thawing, we need to also have these conversations that the greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane are getting released because there are bacteria which are decomposing the plant and animal material which was previously under the permafrost. So there are so many conversations that how do we these regions will be prone to more carbon emissions, or if we are going to do farming, we're going to also contribute to carbon emissions because we're going to be losing our carbon sinks. So there's lots to talk about.
Is anyone else of you wanting to add something from your perspective when it comes to food production or fresh water or for the future of the sustainable food in general? Yes, Sigrid.
Actually, I was thinking about because we have so many, the population is ever increasing, right? So I was thinking about untapped sources of food, like food production. And one thing that I came across in my research was insects as food, which I thought was really interesting because I have a friend who did a research project about, I think, using insects to make some sort of pastry. Yeah, and I thought that was interesting because I think insects require much less resources to grow, not really grow, but yeah, because they take 12 times less feed than cattle for the same amount of protein, and they are also much more environmentally friendly. They don't release as much CO2 or methane as traditional livestock. So I was thinking in the future, obviously there's some issues with insects being accepted widely as a source of food because we kind of find it icky, but it really is an untapped kind of potential area. So for example, I know at least in Singapore there's some startup that uses black soldier fly larvae to break down food waste and turn it into animal feed and other biomaterials. So, or just using insects and making protein from that. I was wondering why do we not really do that yet? Because we don't think about how sausages are made, even though it is kind of disgusting. So why not we just take insects and use them as food, because they really are much less resource intensive to produce and have less of an impact on the environment. Yeah,
it's interesting. You mentioned in many of the discussions today, you talk about solutions that seem to already exist, but that we are not, by some reason, not using on different topics we have discussed today. And I guess there are many concerns, and they can be both ethical and societal-wise, not something that seems to be acceptable, or other things that makes these things not. Everything from cybersecurity to eating insects or fertilizers. I mean, there are many levels where it feels like there are a lot of solutions out there, but that we are not using. So that is also something to take home from, and also to you who are watching, that there are many things that actually we can do. I don't know. Did you want to add something, Nelly?
Yes, I think that if we are discussing this context, we should also address fresh water, because that's also one of the concerns regarding the climate crisis. And I think that what we should do is also make the most of the water that we have. So recycling water has been discussed for a while now. Microbiology offers a lot of potential in this field. We can come up with ways to treat water using microbes so that we can reuse this water that otherwise would be discarded. So I think, as you just mentioned, we have a lot of ideas and a lot of tools, but we really need to see them materialize.
We need to start reusing them. Hector?
I think in discussing solutions, we need to consider many approaches and just all the consequences that stem from what we're doing, right? Whenever we address, say, bacterial infections among agriculture, cattle production, sure, we can use antibiotics as a means to prevent this incidence of infections, but then we look at the people and then we see a spread of bacterial resistance, right? So we have one solution that is not essentially a cure-all solution, despite antibiotics being involved. And it just goes to show, the importance of considering different approaches and the sustainable solutions, because these sustainable solutions, to be truly sustainable, they have to work and they need to be efficient in multiple aspects, right? If something's working in agriculture, but it's not working in healthcare, then it's not working in neither aspect of life.
David, I think that, I mean, for you and I, who are not as young as fresh as the group here and our viewers.
For me, that's
Yeah. I feel quite happy and optimistic to hear all these, input and good suggestions and focusing on solutions rather than problems. Do you want to just conclude this topic by some reflections on this?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is really important in science is also the sociology of how people respond to science. And one thing I mentioned earlier today, which I absolutely believe is true, I'm interested in as an academic, I'm constantly getting older, but my group always stays the same age, right? They always stay between 18 and 25. So I get to work with people, and I can see, honestly, right now, there is a purpose and there is a drive and activism, if you want to see it, to sort of think about how do we go about solving these problems. You can feel it, it's real. And I think one of the things that I take great optimism from is an understanding that human beings, when faced with adversity, can really address adversity, but it requires people who actually care. And one of the things that I see amongst people, not just around this table, but in general amongst younger people, is this desire to actually leave the world in a better place than what they actually found it in.
That's fantastic. That's something that we can end this topic with. So I thank you all for contributing to a better and brighter future through science. And to our viewers, you can continue this conversation on how to make our future more sustainable and brighter by downloading our free-of-use appendix to bring to your classroom, science club, or family and friends dinner. Thank you so much.